Winter came early that year, not the kind of early that old men joked about, not the kind that hunters shrugged off with tightened cloaks and quiet confidence, but the kind that arrived like a verdict. The rivers skinned over in a single night. The forest went silent, as if something had warned it to stop breathing. Snow did not fall gently. It came down hard, heavy, and relentless, burying trails, choking fields, erasing paths that had been walked for generations. The villages of the Iroquois Confederacy had survived many winters before this. They had endured famine, sickness, war. They had learned how to store corn, how to dry meat, how to read the signs of the sky and the animals. But this winter ignored all knowledge. Traps came back empty, the deer vanished, even the wolves stopped howling, as if they had fled or been swallowed by something deeper in the woods. At first, hunger crept in quietly. Meals grew smaller. Children learned not to ask for seconds. Fires burned lower, not for lack of wood, but because people no longer gathered close together. Hunger makes people distant. It pulls them inward. It sharpens the edges of every thought. By the second moon, hunger had teeth. Old stories began to surface again. Stories that had not been spoken aloud for many winters. Stories about times when the world tilted the wrong way, when balance was lost, and things that should never walk or fly were allowed to exist. Elders spoke softly near the fires, careful not to let their words travel too far into the dark. They warned the people not to wander alone. They warned them not to answer voices in the forest. And most of all, they warned them to keep the fires burning, because something had begun to scream at night. At first, it was mistaken for wind, then for animals. But the sound did not belong to any creature that walked on four legs or crawled on earth. It was too high, too sharp, too full of hunger. A shrill, tearing cry that echoed through the trees and lingered long after it stopped, vibrating in the chest like a struck drum. The screams moved. One night they came from the north, the next from the river, the night after that from directly above the village. Though nothing could be seen in the sky, people began to disappear. Not entire families, not warriors in battle, just individuals. Someone sent to check traps, someone who stepped outside to relieve themselves, someone who walked too far from the firelight, believing they knew these woods well enough to survive a short distance alone. They were not found torn apart, they were not found frozen, they were not found at all, until the first head was discovered. It lay near the edge of the forest, half buried in snow. No body, no tracks leading away. Just the head, eyes wide open, mouth frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The hair was scorched black, stiff and brittle, as if it had been burned by intense heat. The elders recognized the signs immediately, and their fear was unmistakable. They did not weep, they did not pray, they ordered the fire fed, because this was no ordinary death. That night, the air grew heavier. Snow fell slower, thicker, as if the sky itself was watching. The screams returned, closer now, circling the village. Dogs whined and hid. Fires flared and bent sideways, though there was no wind. Then the children saw it first, a shape moving above the tree line. At first, it looked like a shadow, round, unnatural, drifting where no bird could fly. Then it dipped lower, and the firelight caught it. What floated above the village was not a spirit, not an animal, not anything that belonged to the living world. It was a head, a human head, enormous and grotesque, with eyes glowing like embers and a mouth stretched wide enough to swallow a man's arm. Its hair was ablaze, not with ordinary fire, but with a living flame that twisted and snapped as it moved. The heat from it could be felt even from the ground, a dry, searing warmth that smelled of burning flesh and old blood. It circled once, slowly, deliberately, as if choosing. Then it screamed. The sound shattered whatever hope remained. It was hunger given a voice, raw, endless, and furious. The flying head dove toward the village, jaws snapping, fire raining from its ear as people scattered in terror. Warriors raised spears that could not reach it. Arrows flew and bounced harmlessly away. The creature laughed, a wet, gurgling sound that echoed off the trees. This was no single monster. As the first head rose again into the sky, others followed, from the forest, from the river, from the darkness between the stars. Dozens of burning heads lifted into the air, circling the village like vultures that had learned to fly before their prey was dead. The elders knew then what this winter had brought back. The flying heads had returned, and they were hungry. The fires roared higher as the people huddled together, knowing one truth with terrible clarity: if the flames went out, the night would feed. The night did not end when the flying heads withdrew. It only loosened its grip enough to breathe. By dawn, the village looked as though it had survived a battle without ever seeing an enemy on the ground. Snow around the long houses was blackened and melted into uneven scars. Ash drifted where embers had fallen from burning hair. Spears lay broken, arrows snapped or warped by heat. No blood stained the earth, not because no one had been taken, but because the flying heads left nothing behind when they fed. The people gathered silently as the sky lightened. No one spoke at first. Words felt useless against what had been seen. Children clung to their mothers, eyes fixed upward, afraid the monsters might still be watching from the pale morning sky. Hunters stared at the forest with the look of men who knew their skill meant nothing now. The elders met near the central fire, their faces drawn and hollow. They spoke names rarely spoken, names that carried weight and consequence. These were not spirits of the dead in the way people understood ancestors. These were things born of hunger, so great it severed a person from their own body. Cannibals, the elders said. People who had eaten human flesh during desperate winters long ago, whose greed had twisted them into something less than human and more than a curse. Flying heads were not created by accident. They were made by choice. The elders warned the people that what had been seen was only the beginning. Flying heads never traveled alone. They followed starvation. They circled villages weakened by hunger, waiting for fear to loosen defenses. They were clever. They tested fires, learned routines, listened for crying children and whispered prayers. And they remembered. That day, the people worked without pause. Fires were reinforced, not just with wood, but with resin-rich branches that burned hotter and brighter. New fire pits were dug at the edges of the village to prevent the darkness from pressing too close. The strongest warriors were assigned to keep flames alive through the night, their only weapon against creatures that laughed at spears. No one was allowed to walk alone. No one was allowed to leave the firelight after sunset. Even so, fear crept through the village like a second cold. The screams returned the following night. This time they came lower, closer, sharper. The flying heads did not dive immediately. They hovered beyond the reach of firelight, just far enough to remain silhouettes against the sky. Their flaming hair illuminated their faces in flickering orange, revealing cracked skin stretched tight over bone, teeth jagged and blackened, eyes rolling with hunger. They spoke, not in words, but in sounds that carried meaning. Mocking cries, half-formed imitations of human voices, a child's laugh twisted into something cruel, a woman's scream stretched until it became laughter. The people covered their ears, but sound has a way of finding its way inside regardless. One head drifted closer than the others, descending slowly until its burning hair scorched the tops of nearby trees. It stopped above a fire pit, hovering just beyond the heat. studying the people below like animals trapped in a ring of light. Then it lunged. The head slammed into the fire, jaws snapping shut around burning logs. Flames roared up its face. For a moment, the people believed it had worked, that fire had claimed the monster. But the flying hell pulled back, laughing, smoke pouring from its mouth as it chewed and swallowed the burning wood whole. It fed on fire. Panic rippled through the village. If fire was not enough, then nothing was. The head darted away, circling the long houses, snapping at the edges of light. Another followed, then another. They tested boundaries, darting in and out, drawing closer each time. One swooped low enough to snatch a basket from a woman's hands, tearing it apart midair just to scatter its contents across the snow. They were not just hunting food, they were breaking the people. Then came the moment that changed everything. A young warrior, desperate and terrified, ran from the firelight. He believed he could reach the forest, believed he could hide among the trees like prey had always done. His feet barely touched the snow before a shadow fell over him. The flying head struck with terrifying precision. It did not tear him apart. It bit down once, clean, brutal, and lifted back into the air with his head clamped between its jaws. His body collapsed where he stood, blood streaming in the cold as the creature flew upward, laughing. The scream that followed from the village was louder than any before. The elders knew then that what waiting meant death. Fires alone would not save them. The flying heads were growing bolder, closer, more confident with each pass. Hunger had sharpened them, and fear had weakened the village. Something had to change. That night, one elder spoke of an old trick, something passed down not as a lesson, but as a last resort. A way to turn the flying head's hunger against them, a way that required courage, sacrifice, and an understanding of what these monsters truly desired, not flesh, not fire, but satisfaction. As the screams circled overhead and burning hair lit the sky, the people prepared for something desperate, because by morning there might be no village left to save, and the flying heads were no longer content to wait. By the third night, the flying heads no longer hid their intentions. They did not wait for darkness to fully settle. They rose at dusk, lifting from the forest like embers carried on an unseen wind. The sky dimmed around them as if the light itself recoiled. Their flaming hair burned brighter than before, each head moving with confidence now, no longer testing, no longer circling cautiously. They had learned. The village had not slept. No one trusted the silence anymore. Fires were kept roaring, fed constantly, their glow pushing back the trees but never quite far enough. Smoke hung low, clinging to the long houses, stinging eyes and throats. The air smelled of resin, sweat, and fear. The elders gathered again, but their voices were strained. Stories had become plans. Legends had become instructions. Flying heads were driven by the endless hunger, but hunger did not make them mindless. It made them patient, clever, cruel. They remembered past winters, past villages, past victims. They remembered what had fooled them once and what never would again. That night the screams changed. They were closer to words now, not true language, but shapes of speech, twisted echoes of things once human. One flying head hovered low and let out a sound that almost resembled a plea. Another mimicked the cry of an infant so perfectly that several women surged forward before warriors dragged them back into the firelight. The monsters laughed when that happened. They drifted lower, closer, their shadows stretching across the snow like grasping hands. One head darted forward suddenly, snapping at a fire pit, scattering embers. Another slammed into the side of a longhouse, rattling its wooden frame, leaving scorched marks where its hair brushed the walls. They were learning how to break shelter, Then they began to speak hunger into the air. A flying head descended near the edge of the village and vomited out a half-chewed bundle of charred wood and bone. It dropped into the snow with a wet thud. The message was clear. Fire did not stop them. Fear fed them. One elder stepped forward holding a torch high. His voice cut through the chaos, steady despite the terror pressing in. He shouted warnings, reminders of what the flying heads once were. Men who had abandoned their people, who had eaten their own when hunger came. He reminded them that these creatures were cursed not just with hunger, but with memory, the remembered taste. That was when the elders revealed the truth they had been holding back. Flying heads could be tricked, but only once, and the cost of the trick was unbearable to speak aloud. They craved flesh, but they craved satisfaction more. They could be made to believe they had eaten enough, that their hunger had been fulfilled, but the offering had to be irresistible, something that would override their endless need to hunt, something made with intention. The plan spread quietly through the village, carried in whispers between the fires. People recoiled when they understood. Some refused outright. Others went silent, staring into the flames as if searching for answers that would not come. Before the decision could be settled, the flying heads attacked again. They swooped in unison this time, coordinated and fast. One slammed into a fire pit, scattering burning logs. Another grabbed the warrior by the shoulders and lifted him screaming into the air before tearing away, leaving his body crumpled and lifeless below. Panic erupted. The monsters screamed louder, feeding on the chaos, darting through smoke and sparks. The village was no longer a circle of fire. It was breaking apart, pockets of light swallowed by shadows. That was when an old woman stepped forward. She moved slowly, deliberately, ignoring the screams overhead. In her hands, she carried a bundle wrapped in hide. She walked to the center of the village and placed it near the largest fire. Her face was calm, but her eyes were wet. The elders understood immediately. The bundle was opened. Inside was food, not ordinary food, but something prepared with care, with ritual, with a terrible purpose. Meat shaped and cooked to resemble what the flying heads craved most. The smell rose into the air, rich and unmistakable. The flying heads froze. One by one, they turned toward the scent. Their screams shifted, becoming low, eager growls. They descended slowly, cautiously, drawn by hunger so deep it drowned out suspicion. The old woman did not run. She stood by the fire as the first flying head lowered itself, jaws snapping inches from the ground. It inhaled deeply, eyes rolling back in pleasure. It bit. The reaction was immediate. The head convulsed midair, jerking violently as if struck. It screamed, not in hunger, but in rage and confusion. The others recoiled, circling wildly as the first trashed, cupping smoke and flame. The trick had worked, but not the way the elders had hoped, because the flying heads had tasted deception, and they would not forget it. The night exploded into fury. The flying heads did not retreat that night. They rose higher, faster, screaming with a fury that shook snow from the trees and split the air like kraken eyes. The deception had not weakened them, it had sharpened them. Hunger, when denied, does not fade, it mutates. The first head to taste the offering screamed loudest of all. Its fire flared violently, burning white hot, its mouth snapping open and shut as if trying to tear the taste from its own memory. It surged upward, spinning erratically, before slamming back down toward the village with renewed savagery. The others followed. This time they did not circle, they attacked. One dove straight through the smoke and fire, smashing into a longhouse roof. Flaming hair ignited dried bark and wooden beams. Sparks scattered like insects as people inside fled, screaming. Another flying head swooped low, jaws snapping at anyone who strayed even a step from the firelight. Teeth clacked inches from skin, hot scorched faces. Panic replaced order. The elders shouted commands, but their voices were swallowed by chaos. The flying heads were no longer testing defenses, they were dismantling them. They worked together now, driving people away from the fires, forcing them into darkness where the monsters had the advantage. One head would swoop low, screaming, forcing people to scatter. Another would follow immediately behind, striking at those who stumbled or hesitated. They had learned how fear moved. Snow melted in wide circles when they passed, leaving slick, steaming ground that caused people to slip and fall. Fires were knocked apart, scattered, stomped into embers by frantic feet. Shadows thickened at the edges of the village, and in those shadows, death hovered patiently. A warrior hurled a spread with all his strength. It pierced straight through one flying head's cheek and out the other side. For a heartbeat, hope surged, then the head laughed. It twisted midair, snapping the spear shaft with its teeth. The wound closing as fire crawled across it. The spear fell uselessly into the snow. The monster dove and ripped the warrior's throat open in a single brutal bite. The message was unmistakable. Steel, wood, and courage meant nothing here. Only fire slowed them down, and only barely. As the village fractured, people fled toward the forest, believing movement might save them. That belief lasted seconds. Flying heads chased them into the trees, darting between branches with terrifying agility. Screams echoed, cut short one by one, swallowed by the dark. Those who remained clung together around the central fire, eyes wide, bodies shaken. The elders realized too late that the offering had not satisfied the flying heads. It had insulted them. The monsters did not want to be fooled. They wanted surrender. They wanted the village to break itself. Then something changed. Amid the chaos, one flying head hovered lower than the rest, directly over the largest fire. Its movement slowed. Its flaming hair dimmed slightly, flickering unevenly. Its eyes rolled, unfocused, as if something inside it was struggling. The elders saw it. This head was older, different. Its screams were weaker, strained, as though its hunger carried weight rather than speed. It drifted closer to the fire, jaws snapping half-heartedly, its flames sputtering when sparks flew too close. The elders understood then what the stories had hinted at but never explained fully. Flying heads burned themselves from the inside. Their hunger was endless, but so was the fire that kept them alive. They fed on flame and flesh alike, but each feeding carried a cost. The older the head, the more unstable the fire. The closer it hovered to burning out completely, a desperate plan formed. The elders shouted for everyone to feed the central fire. Everything, dry wood, resin, tools, even pieces of the long houses themselves, was thrown into the flames. The fire rode higher, hotter than any before, towering into the sky like a challenge. The older flying head descended instinctively. It hovered inches above the inferno, flames licking its scorched skin. It screamed in ecstasy and agony at once, jaws wide as it drank in the heat. Then it screamed differently. Its fire flared violently, then flickered. The glow in its eyes dimmed. Cracks split across its surface like breaking stone. With a final shriek, the head plunged directly into the fire. The explosion of the flame was blinding. When the fire settled, there was nothing left. No ash, no bone. One flying head was gone. The others froze midair. For the first time since they had arrived, silence fell. The remaining heads drifted backward, circling wearily, screaming not in rage, but in warning. They had lost one of their own, and they had learned something new about the people below. The night did not end, but it changed. The village did not sleep, not a soul did. Not even the wind seemed to pass freely through the snow-laden trees. Every shadow became a threat, every crackling ember a shield. The elders huddled near the fire, whispering instructions, watching the remaining flying heads with eyes wide and hearts heavy. No one knew if the remaining heads had watched the fall of the older one, or if they simply understood the stakes themselves. But there was no mistake. They were cautious, calculating. Hunger had sharpened them into hunters, and the loss of one had not dulled their cruelty. It had refined it. The first attack came silently, without a scream. A head dove from above, passing so quickly that only a flash of flaming hair and a glint of ambered eyes could be seen. It snatched the dog from the village edge, lifting it into the air before dropping it far from the firelight. The animal's cries echoed briefly and then ceased, a warning. Families pressed tighter against one another. Children, trembling, were held close while women whispered prayers older than any memory. The elders directed the flow of firelight, ensuring no weak spot could be exploited. But every breath was a battle, every movement a calculation. Then came the second strike. This time, the flying head swooped in low over the frozen river, circling, hunting, its flaming hair lighting up the ice in eerie patterns. It seemed to toy with the villagers, dropping small logs onto the frozen surface, sending sharp, echoing cracks through the quiet. The village realized the horror of the flying head's intelligence. They were no mindless monsters. They were clever. They studied the village, learned its rhythms, and used every opportunity to spread terror. The elders remembered the story, long avoided because of its terrible implications. It spoke of human intervention, of offerings meant to trick the flying heads into believing hunger had been satisfied. But they also warned the heads were cunning, and deception could only work once. After that, hunger and rage fused into something unstoppable. The villagers had tried deception once, and it had worked briefly. But tonight, the heads tested boundaries. Every time a fire roared higher, a head would dive just far enough to snatch a log or knock a pan from the embers. It was a game, cruel and precise, and the villagers were trapped inside it. Some of the younger warriors, driven by panic, attempted to chase the heads with spears and arrows. The results were swift and brutal. One young man, thinking he had a chance, rushed forward only to have a head dive at him mid-stride. He fell, rolling in the snow, his screams cut short as the creature lifted away, leaving him battered but alive. The lesson was clear. Aggression without strategy was death. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. The line between time and terror blurred. The snow continued to fall, thickening, heavy, blanketing the village in a cold silence between each assault. Even the fires seemed to struggle, faltering under the relentless cold and the chaos above. By the deepest hours of the night, the flying heads retreated slightly, hovering at the edges of the village. They had not been repelled, they had merely withdrawn to observe. Their glowing eyes scanned the fires, watching for weakness, listening for sounds of exhaustion or despair. And then came a new sound, a deep, guttural rumble, not from the heads themselves, but from the earth, the frozen ground beneath the village. The elders paused, sensing a shift. The flying heads had recognized something ancient, something waiting. No one could explain it, no one could see it, but the rumble carried snow and ice and bone alike, vibrating through the villagers' chests. Even the heads seemed unsettled, circling lower, their fiery hair flickering in reaction to a force beyond their control. For the first time, the terror that gripped the village was not just from above, it came from beneath, from the frozen ground, from the history of the land itself. And in that moment, all knew this night would not relent until something, either the village or the monsters, was broken entirely. The fires burned brighter, The villagers huddled tighter, and the flying heads awaited, patient predators mastering their prey. The night stretched endlessly, a test of endurance, a battle of wills, a lesson that hunger and fear could make monsters of both the living and the dead. The Iroquois village would survive or die, and the flying heads would be watching every heartbeat. The night had stretched into hours without mercy, and the village now resembled a battlefield caught between fire and shadow. Every flicker of the flames seemed to hold both hope and doom. Smoke rose thick and heavy, curling into the darkened sky, carrying with it the scent of resin, burnt wood, and terror. Yet still, the flying heads had not relented. They had learned the villagers' patterns. Every time someone approached the edge of the firelight to feed the flames or retrieve water, a head would dive, hovering just beyond reach, snapping jaws, flames licking at the snow. Their intelligence was terrifying. They studied movement, testing for fear and punishing hesitation instantly. The elders convened urgently, their whispered strategies carrying through the crackling air. They discussed the only tactic left, turning the fly-heads' hunger against themselves. It was dangerous, uncertain, and required sacrifice, but they knew that without action, the village would not see sunrise. Their chosen method was perilous. The elders would construct a trap, a fire pit far from the village, laden with the most enticing bait they could muster: raw meat, logs soaked in resin, and charms blessed by ancient rites. It would be a lure, drawing the flying heads away, giving the villagers a silver of hope. Even as preparations began, the heads sensed it. One swooped close to the elder crafting the fire pit. Its glowing eyes filled with awareness. It shrieked, a sound so full of fury that the villagers flinched, hearts hammering. The smoke from the existing fires seemed to curl around it, but the creature remained unharmed, floating in the air like a living blaze. Warriors stationed themselves near the edges, watching the perimeter of firelight. They could do nothing to strike the heads directly, but they could maintain the illusion of strength, guiding the monsters toward the trap. Every step, every movement had to be precise. Miscalculation meant death. As the trap fire was lit, one head approached first, drawn by the scent of resin and meat. It hovered, evaluating, its mouth opening in a silent scream that carried hunger, curiosity, and rage all at once. Then another followed, then another. The villagers held their breath. Silence fell, but it was fragile. Every crack of snow beneath a footstep felt deafening. The flying heads circled the trap fire, mesmerized by its heat and scent. They descended, flames flickering across their air, casting monstrous shadows on the snow. Each movement was careful, deliberate. They had tasted deception before. They were cautious now, aware of the villagers' intentions. The first had struck the fire pit, snapping at the bait. The resin ignited in a sudden flare, engulfing the creature momentarily. It screeched, spinning in the air, its fire flaring even brighter. The villagers watched as the trap worked, feeding both their hope and terror simultaneously. Then came the unexpected. One head, older and larger than the others, lunged not for the bait, but toward the central village fire. It flew low, teeth snapping, flames trailing dangerously close to the long houses. Its shriek split the night, commanding attention. The villagers realized that the flying heads had adopted once again. Hunger was not their only weapon. They wielded terror, strategy, and relentless persistence. One mistake, one hesitation, and the village could be destroyed despite their careful planning. In response, the elders directed everyone to double the central fires, reinforcing them with wet logs and resin-soaked branches. Warriors stood ready to push anyone who strayed back towards safety. Women and children huddled, listening to the terrifying symphony above. The trap worked partially. The heads were drawn toward the bait, but only temporarily. Hunger had made them patient predators. They tested and circled, retreating when the fires flared too high, then striking when a moment of distraction appeared. By midnight, the village understood that the battle was not just about survival, but endurance. The flying heads tested the limits of both human courage and flame. They were relentless, observing, learning, and striking when weakness appeared. The elders knew that no plan could stop them entirely. They could only delay the inevitable, stretch the night, and hope that some measure of cunning, sacrifice, and unity might see the first light of dawn. And as the flying heads circled higher, their flaming hair streaking the sky, the village held its breath, realizing fully the truth that terror had taught them. Some monsters did not tire, some hunger never ended. The night pressed on, a test of spirit, fire, and resolve that would mark the memory of Iroquois forever. Dawn seemed impossible that night. Even when the sky lightened faintly behind the thick clouds, it did little to soften the shadows caused by the flying heads' blazing forms. The creatures were everywhere, hovering, swooping, circling, testing every inch of the village perimeter. Each movement sent sparks and shards of ice flying from the snow, scattering chaos across the already fractured settlement. The villagers had grown exhausted, their muscles trembling, their voices hoarse from shouting warnings and instructions, yet no one dared step away from the firelight for more than a moment. The elders moved between them, chanting under their breaths old words meant to guide, protect, and remind the people that courage was their only weapon that the monsters could not consume. The first wave of flying heads approached the trap fire again. This time, they did not descend immediately. They hovered above, circling, studying, their glowing eyes scanning for threats, for weakness, for anything that betrayed the villagers' desperation. Flames from the pit danced across their faces, making their twisted features visible in bursts of horrifying clarity, faces contorted in eternal hunger, eyes bright with fiery intensity, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. A young woman, braver than most or perhaps driven by despair, stepped forward the fire to stoke it. She froze as a head swooped close, its flaming hair brushing the snow beside her feet. She could feel the heat, the smell of burning flesh, and the weight of its gaze, as if the monster could see into her very soul. Every instinct told her to run, every sense screamed death, yet she did not. Her courage became a spark of defiance that spread quickly. Others followed, working to strengthen the fires, throwing logs and resin into the blaze. The flying heads shrieked and twisted, their patience tested, but they did not retreat entirely. They were masters of torment, circling relentlessly, striking when opportunity arose, yet unable to extinguish the overwhelming heat that now dominated the village. One of the larger heads dove suddenly, straight for a longhouse on the village edge. It tore into the roof with a thunderous crash, setting wood ablaze. Villagers screamed, dragging children from the structure as flames roared higher. The heat retreated into the air, laughing, or at least something that resembled laughter, a gurgling, fiery sound that echoed across the snowy clearing. Another head hovered low near the trap, drawn by the scent of meat and resin. It hesitated, sensing the danger, then lunged, pulling chunks of fire-soaked wood into the sky. Sparks flew like deadly rain, and for a moment the trap became a chaotic storm of flame, ice, and terror. Amid this chaos, the elders continued their chants, directing the villagers with precision. They reminded them that flying heads were not invincible. They could be tricked, challenged, delayed, but they required cunning and timing. Every fire, every ember, every movement of flesh and shadow mattered. The night stretched on. Each second was drawn out, heavy with fear, heavy with anticipation. Every head's screech was a drumbeat against human resilience, every fiery dive a test of resolve. The villagers realized that the flying heads were not merely hungry, they were teaching, punishing, and reminding the living of their vulnerability. By the early hours, something shifted. One head, smaller than the others but swift and cunning, lingered at the center of the trap fire. Its glowing eyes locked onto the old woman who had prepared it. Her hands shook, but she held her ground, feeding the flames with deliberate, calm movements. The monster's attention was fixed entirely on her, its flaming hair curling like serpents in the night air. And then, without warning, it lunged not at her, but at the fire itself. The blaze flared violently, consuming logs and resin, smoke rising thick as the monster twisted and recoiled in confusion. It shrieked, a sound that was part rage, part agony, and vanished into the darkness above. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The villagers dared not breathe. They had survived another round, but the flying heads were patient. They had tasted defiance and would remember. The night was not over, it was only learning. By the time the 8th hour of darkness pressed upon the village, exhaustion had settled into every bone and sinew of the people. The snow was trampled, blackened in patches by footprints, embers, and the occasional streaks of fire. Every longhouse bore scars, every fire was a fragile fortress against the relentless horror above. The flying heads moved with a terrifying intelligence now. They no longer circled randomly or attacked impulsively. Each dive, each screech, each swoop seemed calculated, almost ritualistic. They learned from every attempt, adapting to the villagers' defenses, anticipating movement, exploiting hesitation. Their hunger had sharpened into cunning. One had descended near the eastern edge of the village, dragging a long, carved branch through the snow like a weapon. Its flaming hair flared with each movement, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the frozen landscape. Children clutched at their mothers, huddling close to the firelight, while warriors trembled behind their shields of heat and smoke. The elders called for the villagers to reinforce the fires, to keep them roaring without pause. Every log thrown was a small act of defiance, every spark a tiny victory. Yet the flying heads were relentless, darting low to snatch, burn, and terrorize, never resting, never ceasing their torment. The trap fire lit several hours earlier glowed like a beacon. A smaller flying head hovered above it, intrigued and wary. It circled slowly, assessing, sniffing the smoke, tasting the scent of resin and meat. The villagers watched, hearts in their throats, knowing that if it accepted the trap, it might draw the others into a false sense of satisfaction. Suddenly, one head dove toward a longhouse near the trap. Flames licked at its teeth as it snapped, sending burning embers into the snow. The villagers screamed, scrambling to douse the sparks before they ignited more chaos. One young warrior leaped forward, hurling a spear with desperate precision. It grazed the monster's jaw, leaving a scorch mark but failing to halt its assault. The flying heads adopted instantly. They veered, attacking in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Each swoop pushed the villagers closer to the center fires, closer to the carefully laid trap, forcing them into alignment without realizing it. Amid the terror, one elder stepped forward, chanting in a voice both commanding and traveling. He reminded the villagers that the monsters were creatures of ancient hunger, bound by curiosity as much as appetite. They could be outsmarted, delayed, and even tricked, but only if every movement, every ember, every shadow was accounted for. The snow began to fall heavier, blanketing the village in silence between the strikes. It muffled the screams, the clatter of wood, the snap of embers, making each attack feel sharper, more sudden. The flying head seemed almost to glide on this silence, appearing where least expected, disappearing again into the shadows beyond the firelight. The night pressed on. Every minute was a test of endurance, every breath a challenge to courage. The villagers realized that their survival depended not just on the fires or the trap, but on their unity, their discipline, and their willingness to confront the monsters with unwavering focus. And so, through the eighth hour, the flying heads hovered, hunted, and circled their fiery forms, casting shadows that would be etched into memory forever. The village held, trembling, waiting for the dawn that might never come, aware that the night was far from over and the flying heads were far from finished. The night had grown heavier, as if darkness itself had weighed, pressing down upon the village, upon the snow, upon the hearts of those who remained. Each minute stretched into an eternity, each scream echoing like a bell of warning. The flying heads no longer simply circled, they studied, they remembered, they adapted. Hunger alone had evolved into something far more dangerous, intelligence coupled with malice. The snow was trampled into a slippery, uneven mess dotted with blackened footprints, patches of burnt wood, and the occasional smear of blood. The villagers had grown quiet, moving only when necessary, each motion deliberate. Children were wrapped in layers of furs, eyes wide and brimming with tears, trembling in the shadows of long houses that had become both refuge and trap. Mothers whispered prayers, half chant, half sob, hoping that the spirits would grant them protection or mercy. Above, the flying heads moved like predators orchestrating an endless symphony of fear. One descended toward the largest fire with blazing precision, testing the villagers' nerves. It hovered, jaws snapping, flaming hair dancing across the frozen air. The smell of charred meat and resin wafted up to it, and for a moment it paused, as if savoring the scent, teasing, but not yet satisfied. Then came the sudden strike. Without warning, another head darted low over the snow, claws and jaws extended, snatching a bundle of logs thrown to feed the central fire. Sparks flew as teeth, and flame met resin-soaked wood. The villagers screamed, but the flying head laughed, or something that resembled laughter, gurgling and jagged, echoing across the icy clearing. The elders shouted, their voices cracking, giving instructions, trying to maintain order amidst the chaos. They moved deliberately among the villagers, guiding them to add fuel to the fires, to reinforce weak points, to stay together. Every ember mattered, every shadow counted. The flying heads began to test new tactics. One hovered near the periphery, mimicking the cries of a child. A young mother froze, heart stopping, reaching instinctively, only to be pulled back by a warrior who slammed a hand across her mouth. The head twisted in midair, screeching, testing, learning why emotions it could manipulate. The villagers realized with growing horror that the monsters were not just hungry, they were cruelly intelligent. They understood fear, calculated desperation, and exploited even the smallest lapse in concentration. They were learning faster than the villagers could adapt, and the night seemed to stretch endlessly under their relentless scrutiny. A breakthrough occurred when the elders noticed that the heads hesitated at the edges of extreme heat. The central fire, blazing like a miniature sun, held their attention, dominated their senses, but it also imposed a limitation. The larger heads would approach, hover, but never dive fully into it. They were creatures of fire and flesh, yet fire could still control them temporarily. Using this knowledge, the elders directed a small group of warriors to reinforce the trap, adding heat, scent, and careful deception. Raw meat, herbs, resin, and other substances were arranged to appeal the monstrous appetite of the flying heads. The villagers understood that this was a gamble, their only chance, but one misstep could mean death. And the flying heads observed it all, circling, diving, retreating, reacting to every placement. One larger, older head hovered near the trap, its eyes glowing brighter than the others, as if testing the authenticity of the bait. Flames flickered across its hair, casting grotesque shadows across the village. The attack intensified. Smaller heads swooped low, snatching embers from the fire, tearing at snow-covered logs, and testing every path the villagers might take. They were relentless, and yet the villagers endured. Fear had sharpened their focus. Exhaustion was tempered by determination. The Iroquois knew that the flying heads were testing them, not just their courage, but their ingenuity, their unity, their ability to survive as one. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The elders whispered ancient wisdom, guiding every action, reminding the people that the night would not end through strength alone. The flying heads could not be destroyed. They could only be delayed, deceived, and outlasted. As the ninth hour passed on, the village remained a fragile island of fire and hope in a sea of terror. The flying heads, relentless and intelligent, circled above like living nightmares, teaching the living a lesson that would linger for generations, that hunger, cunning, and fear, when combined, can shape monsters beyond imagination, and that survival requires not just strength, but unwavering vigilance, courage, and unity. The 10th hour arrived with a weight that pressed down on every living soul in the village. Exhaustion was no longer a feeling. It was a tangible presence settling into bones, muscles, and minds. Eyes burned from staring into flickering firelight, voice hoarse from endless shouting, and the snow beneath their feet was trampled, uneven battlefield marked with soot, blood, and scattered embers. The flying heads, ever observant, adopted with a horrifying precision. They no longer merely circled or dived, they coordinated. One head would lure villagers toward a trap, while another swooped in from an unexpected angle, testing reactions, forcing mistakes. Hunger had sharpened into a calculating intelligence, and fear had become a tool that monsters wielded with cruel efficiency. From the tallest longhouse, a warrior leaped, hurling a spear at a swooping head. It grazed the creature's flaming cheek, sending a spray of sparks into the snow. Yet the head shrieked and twisted in midair, unharmed, and returned with renewed fury. The villagers realized with growing horror that physical strikes could barely harm these monsters. Their vulnerability was something far subtler, something the elders understood but could not manipulate indirectly. The trap fire blazing in the center of the village had become both shield and lure. Flames roared higher, casting monstrous shadows that danced on the snow like living phantoms. The flying heads hovered over it, their flaming hair creating streaks of light that seared the eyes, their glowing eyes reflecting the heat below, their jaws snapping in anticipation. One head, larger than the others, descended close to the trap fire. It inhaled deeply, the smoke curling into its nostrils, and its screech was a blend of rage and longing. Every movement of the villagers was mirrored in its attention. It tested boundaries, snapping at any ember that strayed too far from the blaze. Yet it did not commit fully to the flames, and the elders understood. Fire could guide, could manipulate, but not destroy. The younger warriors, driven by desperation, tried again. They threw spears, ignited small fires at the edges, and shouted to distract the monsters. Each attempt was met with precise, terrifying retaliation. The flying heads swooped low, scraping the snow with flaming hair, sending shards of ice and embers scattering, forcing villagers into defensive positions repeatedly. Every misstep could be fatal, and yet they pressed on, a testament to resilience born of fear and determination. A mother clutched her child, whispering prayers that had survived centuries of oral history. Her voice trembled, but the words carried an ancient authority, a reminder that even amidst this hour, the living had the power to shape the night. The elders coordinated quietly, using every lesson of the previous hours to anticipate the monster's movements. And the flying heads, relentless, adopted. They began testing the edges of perception itself, mimicking voices, circling in patterns that created illusions of multiple heads, diving in and retracting to confuse and intimidate. Shadows seemed to move on their own, embers twisted unnaturally, and the villagers' senses strained under the onslaught. Madness was a whisper at the edges of every mind, a constant pressure to falter, to make a mistake, to die. Amidst the chaos, a breakthrough appeared, not of strength, but of cunning. The elders realized that the flying heads could be manipulated by exploiting their obsession with fire and hunger simultaneously. They arranged logs and resin to create smaller decoy fires, drawing attention away from the main central blaze. The monsters, curious and ever hungry, took the bait, and for a fleeting moment, the village breathed collectively. Yet the victory was fragile. The flying heads learned quickly, circling back to test the decoy fires, their screeches echoing through the snowy forest like rolling thunder. The tension never eased. Every ember, every shadow, every breath carried the weight of potential death. And so, the 10th hour of the night unfolded, a symphony of fire, terror, and survival. The flying heads had taught their lesson repeatedly. Hunger and intelligence could combine into something unstoppable, but the living, united, and clever, could stretch the night, manipulate danger, and survive, if only barely. The village trembled, yet endured. The flying heads hovered above, burning eyes fixed on every movement, teaching that survival was a test, not of strength alone, but patience, courage, and the razor edge of human ingenuity. The 11th hour descended slowly, stretching the night's terror into something almost eternal. The snow, now thick and uneven from the hours of chaos, muffled steps, swallowed whispers, and carried the cries of the terrified into the dark. Fires burned fiercely, but their light was patchy, revealing only glimpses of the horror above. The flying heads were relentless, circling, testing, probing every weakness, learning with every movement. The villagers were near exhaustion, muscles trembled, lungs burned from shouting and running, and their eyes felt strained from staring at flames that did not provide comfort but only flickers of false security. Yet still, they clung to the fires, huddled in groups, listening to the elders' low, commanding chants, drawing strength from words older than memory. These chants were their only shield against the overwhelming darkness. The flying heads had become masters of manipulation. One had descended low, mimicking the cries of a child lost in the snow. A mother, heartbreaking, stepped forward instinctively, only to be restrained by her husband. The monster's screech was deafening, a combination of rage, hunger, and cunning that rattled bones. It circled, testing reactions, understanding how fear could be weaponized against the living. Meanwhile, a smaller head hovered near the trap fire. Its eyes glowed brighter than any before, flickering in reflection of the flames. It was cautious but drawn irresistibly to the combination of heat and scent. The villagers watched, holding their collective breath. One misstep could trigger a storm of death. The central fire burned higher, logs drenched in resin feeding the blaze. Sparks shot in the air, scattering across the snow, creating a barrier that the flying heads hesitated to cross directly. Yet they did not relent. They adopted, diving in unpredictable arcs, snapping at embers, teasing the villagers into movement, forcing errors. The elders, reading the monster's reactions, began a delicate dance of manipulation. Small diversions, false movements, strategic feeding of flames. They guided the flying head's hunger away from the village's weakest points. The creatures were intelligent, yes, but they were not invincible. Even their cunning could be misdirected. A sudden attack came from the largest head. It swooped low toward the longhouse, its flaming hair trailing like molten fire over snow. A warrior hurled a spear, hitting the creature's jaw. Sparks flew. illuminating the horror, but the head twisted midair and retreated, only to return moments later with greater force. The villagers saw that brute strength alone was insufficient. Only strategy, patience, and unity could prolong survival. Hours had passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. The villagers could no longer measure time in the conventional sense. The flying heads tested every limit: patience, courage, and endurance. The night became a living entity, shaped by fire, fear, and the relentless hunger of monsters above. Yet within this chaos, small victories emerged. Every time a head hesitated, every time it was drawn toward a decoy fire, the villagers gained precious moments of breathing room. Each ember thrown, each movement carefully calculated, became a statement of defiance, a challenge to the hunger and cunning above. By the 11th hour, a fragile rhythm had been established. The flying heads continued their circling, screeching, swooping, but the villagers had learned too. They were no longer merely reacting, they were anticipating, adapting, surviving. The night was far from over, but a glimmer of hope threaded through the terror, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, resilience could shape fate. And still the flying heads hovered, ever observant, ever hungry, their burning eyes recording every human action, their shadows etched forever into the memory of those who endured. The first light of dawn was faint, a silver thread stretching across the horizon, yet it brought no immediate relief. The village had endured nearly 12 hours of unrelenting terror. Fires still blazed, though they were smaller now, struggling against fatigue and snow. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood, resin, and fear, and every villager bore the weight of exhaustion etched into trembling muscles and frozen faces. Above the flying heads hovered, their flaming hair muted in the early light, eyes glowing like embers that refused to die. They had not been defeated, only delayed. Hunger still ruled them, yet the subtle shift in firelight and human resilience had forced them into reconsider their approach. Their circle with caution now, testing boundaries, searching for weakness that no longer existed. The villagers emerged slowly from the shadows of the long houses, eyes wide but resolute. Children clung to their parents, warriors shook with fatigue yet stood tall, and the elders chanted softly, not for defense now, but in thanksgiving, honoring the endurance and unity that had preserved the living through a night the like of which none could have imagined. One of the younger warriors, a boy not yet fully grown, ventured to the edge of the central fire, embers crackling around him. He spotted a smaller flying head hovering at the trap, drawn yet hesitant, unsure if the bait was real or a trick. With careful precision, he threw a resin-soaked log into the pig, sending sparks high into the sky. The head recoiled, startled by the flare, and retreated toward the forest, wings flaring, circling higher before vanishing into the trees beyond the village. The larger heads followed, one by one, retreating slowly, observing, and perhaps learning that the village was not to be conquered easily. Their screeches faded into the distance, swallowed by the snow and the awakening dawn. Yet the memory of their terror lingered in every frozen footprint, every burnt ember, every heart that still pounded in exhausted relief. The elders gathered the villagers near the central fire. They spoke of survival, of unity, of courage, and of the lessons taught by monsters not of this era, but of the land itself. The flying heads were not merely creatures of destruction, they were mirrors of human fear, intelligence, and endurance. To survive was not to conquer, but to endure, to outlast, to respect the forces beyond mortal control. Families huddled together, embracing in the weak warmth of dawn, tears and smiles mingling. Children asked questions that no one could fully answer. Where had the monsters gone? Would they return? The elders answered in stories, in lessons, and in silence, for the truth was as old as the Iroquois themselves. Some monsters never truly leave, they linger in memory, and caution in the shared history of survival. The village slowly came back to life. Fires were replenished, longhouses repaired, and the frozen ground began to take on a semblance of peace. Yet every villager, from the smallest child to the oldest elder, carried a newfound understanding of fear, strategy, and the fragile, enduring bond of human courage. And high above, hidden in the shadows of the forest, the flying heads watched, waiting for another night, another chance, a reminder that terror and survival were forever intertwined, and that those who endured had earned a story that would be told for generations. The night had ended, but the legend, the lesson, the memory, the terror was eternal.